The air in Montgomery, Alabama was thick with summer heat, the kind that stuck to your skin and made the city feel smaller than it already was. Travis Bennett sat on the steps of his small law office, rolling a cigarette between his fingers, staring at the courthouse across the street. He had grown up here, on these same streets, listening to stories from his grandfather about marches, protests, police batons, and fire hoses aimed at black bodies like they were meant to be washed away. But that was the past, people told him. The past was supposed to stay buried. Yet every day in his office, he saw how the past had simply changed its disguise. He had spent the last 5 years fighting eviction cases, representing black families who were being pushed out of their homes under the city's new redevelopment plan. On paper, it was about progress, about improving Montgomery's economic future. In reality, it was a modern-day land grab. Because when the city talked about progress, they didn't mean for people like him. It started with the Victory Project, a billion-dollar initiative backed by wealthy developers, politicians, and corporate investors, promising to revitalize poor neighborhoods. The first neighborhood on their list? Bellwood, a historically black district that had been home to generations of families since the end of segregation. For decades, it had survived disinvestment, redlining, and gentrification. But now the city had found a new tool: the law. Using eminent domain, fraudulent housing codes, and manipulated zoning laws, the city started issuing eviction notices left and right. And Travis saw it firsthand. Elderly homeowners who had been there for 50 years were suddenly being told their houses were uninhabitable and needed to be torn down. Rents doubled overnight in apartments that had been falling apart for decades, pricing out the very people who had called Bellwood home. And the worst part? The city wasn't even hiding it. They weren't using fire hoses anymore. They were using contracts and court orders. And the people they were pushing out? They weren't just losing home. They were losing history. Travis took on case after case, fighting in courtrooms that smelled like old wood and white power. He faced judges who looked at him like a joke, lawyers who smirked when he spoke about fair housing laws, and politicians who shook his hand while making backroom deals to sell Bellwood to white developers. One by one, his clients lost their homes. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because the system had already decided who deserved to stay and who didn't, until he got the Lewis case. And that's when everything changed. Ernest and Loretta Lewis had lived in Bellwood for 53 years, raised their kids there, buried their parents there, watched neighbors come and go, but never thought they'd be the ones forced to leave, until the city sent them an eviction notice claiming their house had been built with outdated infrastructure and needed to be demolished. Travis knew exactly what that meant. They wanted the land, and they thought the Lewises were too old, too tired, too powerless to fight back. But they hadn't counted on him. Travis took the case to trial, knowing the odds were stacked against him. The city brought in experts, real estate analysts, even historians, all claiming the neighborhood was in a state of irreversible decline. Travis listened, and then he burned their case to the ground. He exposed how the city had intentionally denied Bellwood homeowners access to grants for repairs. Shop in their own neighborhood, how they had used property tax loopholes to push black residents out and let white investors swoop in at half the price. The courtroom was silent when he was done. Even the judge, an old white man who had never ruled in favor of a black defendant in his career, looked uneasy. And for a moment, Travis thought they had won, until the verdict came in. The Lewises had lost, and in 60 days their home would be gone. That night, Travis sat in his office, staring at a bottle of whiskey, wondering if he had been stupid for believing the system would ever let them win. And then, a knock at the door. He opened it to find Loretta Lewis standing there, holding a worn-out envelope in her hands. "We're not leaving," she said. Travis frowned. "But the ruling? We ain't asking no judge to save us." She handed him the envelope. Inside was an old deed, one that proved her house was protected under a law passed back in the 1960s. A law that said the city couldn't take land that had been deemed a protected cultural site. A law that had been buried in paperwork, ignored for decades, because no one thought anyone would remember it. Except Loretta Lewis had. And now, the city had just made the biggest mistake of its life. Travis took the case back to court, and this time, he had the receipts. The media caught wind of it. Activists started showing up to Bellwood in droves, protesting in front of City Hall. It wasn't just about the Lewises anymore. It was about every single black homeowner who had been lied to, cheated, and erased. And suddenly, the city was on the defensive, because what they had done, it wasn't just corruption, it was theft. And now the whole world was watching. A month later, the judge overturned the ruling. Not just for the Lewises, but for every family in Bellwood. The redevelopment project? Dead. The corporate investors? Forced to back out. And the city? They had no choice but to return the stolen land. Travis walked out of the courthouse that day to the sound of cheers, fists raised in the air, the sound of a people who had won a fight they weren't supposed to win. And as he looked at the crowd, at Loretta and Ernest standing on their front porch like kings and queens of their own kingdom, he realized this wasn't just about a neighborhood. This was about every black community they had ever tried to erase. And this time, the past had fought back. The southern air hung thick over Montgomery, Alabama, as Travis Bennett stood outside the courthouse, staring at the building that had once been the center of his greatest victory. It had been a year since he saved Bellwood from destruction, forcing the city to return the land they had tried to steal. A year since he had stood alongside Loretta and Ernest Lewis, watching them reclaim their home, their history, their power. But in the South, a black man's victory never came without a cost. And today, he was the one on trial. It had started with a letter from the Alabama Bar Association, a formal notice. An investigation has been opened into alleged legal misconduct in the case of Bellwood versus City of Montgomery. Travis had laughed when he first read it. This was retaliation, plain and simple. The city had lost in court, but they weren't done trying to take him down. The charges were vague, improper use of evidence, misrepresentation of legal documents, coercion of a public official, all of it bullshit. But the message was clear. They couldn't get the land back. So now, they were coming for the man who had stopped them. The hearing was set for Monday morning. Travis walked into the courthouse, head high, suit pressed, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't about justice. This was about punishment. About putting a black man back in his place, and the judge overseeing the case? The same one who had ruled against him in Bellwood. The city had stacked the deck. Their witnesses included two former city attorneys, both claiming Travis had misrepresented facts during the trial. A housing inspector swore under oath that the Bellwood homes had been unsafe, even though Travis had exposed the city's own fraudulent reports. They brought in bank records, phone logs, old case file historying to paint him as a crooked lawyer who had manipulated the system for personal gain. And through it all, Travis just watched, because he knew how this worked. They weren't trying to prove he had done anything wrong. They were just trying to make an example out of him. Then, it was his turn to speak. Travis stepped to the stand, looked each member of the review board in the eye, and told them exactly what had happened. How the city had used illegal housing codes to steal land from black families. How the developers had paid off officials to push the project forward. how his so-called misconduct was nothing more than exposing the truth. The courtroom was silent when he finished, and for the first time, Travis wondered, had he won? The answer came 3 days later. The Alabama Bar Association ruled against him. His license was suspended indefinitely. He was no longer allowed to practice law. And just like that, the man who had fought for Bellwood had been stripped of his ability to fight. He sat on the steps of his old law office, the disbarment letter in his hand, staring at the courthouse across the street. Everything he had built gone. The city had gotten what they wanted. And yet, he wasn't finished. Because power wasn't just about the law, it was about the people. And if they thought they could take him out of the fight, they had underestimated who they were dealing with. 2 months later, he opened the Bellwood Justice Center. Not a law firm, a movement. A place where people could come to fight without needing a courtroom. He organized protests against housing discrimination, led marches through the city, partnered with activists, journalists, and community leaders to expose corruption from the ground up. And before long, the city realized something. They had taken his law license, but they had given him something even stronger. A cause too big to silence. The backlash came fast. They sent police to harass protesters, tried to shut down the center with zoning violations, even put out a warrant for his arrest, claiming he had violated his suspension by practicing law without a license. But the people of Bellwood, they weren't backing down. They raised money for his legal fees, held sit-ins outside the mayor's office, and when they tried to arrest him, they found themselves surrounded by hundreds of people blocking the courthouse steps. A year after his suspension, Travis stood in front of a packed auditorium at Howard University, giving a lecture on civil rights, systemic racism, and the modern-day war on Black progress. His words had traveled far beyond Montgomery. His fight had become bigger than one city, because everywhere across America, the same thing was happening. The same tactics, the same injustices, the same battle for ownership and power. And if they thought one courtroom decision could stop that fight, they had already lost. Travis walked out of the auditorium that night, his phone buzzing. A message from Loretta Lewis. You didn't just save Bellwood, baby. You started something they can't stop. And as he stood there staring out at the city, he realized she was right, because they had tried to silence him. They had tried to erase him. But the thing about history, it always finds its way back. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, they would never bury the truth again. The train rattled through the Texas countryside, cutting through fields of dust and heat, its steel wheels humming against the tracks. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, tired shadows across the earth. Clara Thompson sat near the back of the train car, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had been traveling for hours, watching the landscape change from green to gold, then to the dry, cracked brown of the open plains. Her suitcase sat beside her, its handle worn from years of use. She was going home, except home didn't feel like home anymore. Clara had left Havencrest nearly 15 years ago, escaping the small Texas town the same way her mother had once dreamed of doing. She had taken a scholarship to Howard University, then moved to Chicago, where she found a world that didn't flinch every time she walked into a room. But now, she was going back. Not by choice. Her father was dead. The telegram had arrived 2 weeks ago, heart attack. Service is Sunday. Come home. She hadn't been back since she was 17. And she had sworn she never would be. But some promises didn't hold up against blood. The train pulled into the station at dusk. She stepped onto the platform, the warm wind wrapping around her like an old ghost. Nothing had changed. The roads were still dusty. The houses still sat low against the earth, their porches sagging under the weight of time. The whites' only signs were gone, but the lines still existed in the way people stood, in the way they looked at her. Havencrest hadn't forgotten her, and it hadn't forgiven her either. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, some old church friends, people who had known her father but had never really known her. Clara stood beside her mother in the heat, listening to the preacher talk about heaven and mercy, about how her father was in a better place. She kept her eyes on the ground, pretending not to notice the stares, not just from the white folks, but from her own, because she had left. And in a town like this, leaving was almost as bad as being pushed out. After the service, people murmured their condolences, some polite, some cold. Then she saw him, William Harper. Once, they had been best friends. Once, they had planned to leave together, but William had stayed. And when she looked at him now, she could see why. His hands were rough, his face older than it should have been, his eyes carrying the weight of a town that never let go. He nodded to her. Clara. She hesitated. Will. A long silence stretched between them. Then he exhaled. They're not going to make this easy for you. She knew what he meant. Havencrest didn't like people who came back different, and Clara Thompson had been gone too long. The first sign of trouble came that night. She was sitting on her mother's porch when she heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She turned. A shadow stood at the end of the yard. Tall, unmoving. Then spit hit the dirt. A voice, low and sharp, should have stayed gone. Then he walked away. Clara's fingers curled around the arm of the rocking chair. She had expected this, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. Her mother came out a few minutes later, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. Heard him, she said simply. Clara sighed. Does it ever stop? Her mother smiled, but it wasn't warm. This is Havencrest, baby. It don't ever stop. She should have left after the funeral, but something held her there. Something heavy. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was both. She spent the next few days walking through the town, seeing the places she had once known. The old school, the diner, the courthouse, where trials were never fair, and justice was just a word. Then she saw the sign. It was tacked up on the bulletin board outside the town hall. Colored section closing. Effective immediately. Her stomach dropped. The only grocery store for black families, the only one that hadn't forced them to the back entrance. The only one that had let them shop without shame was shutting down. She turned to the men sitting on the steps of the town hall. You're closing the store? One of them, Jack Rollins, looked up. A man who had never liked her father. That store ain't making money, he said. Clara's jaw tightened. It's the only store we have, Rollins shrugged. Not my problem. The others laughed. She felt the heat rise in her. 15 years had given her space from this place. But now she remembered. She turned on her heel and walked away. But she wasn't done. Not yet. That night, she went to William's house. He opened the door, surprised. I need your help, she said. And when she told him what was happening, when she told him what they were taking, he didn't hesitate. By morning, the whole town knew. Clara Thompson had walked into the grocery store, placed a sign in the window, and announced to anyone who would listen, "We're buying this place." People laughed. People mocked. Some just watched. But the ones who had been left behind, the ones who had suffered in silence, the ones who had thought this was just the way things were, they listened, and they stood with her. Money was raised, contracts were written, and for the first time in Havencrest's long history, a black woman owned a business in town. But Havencrest wasn't done fighting back. Not yet. The threats came first. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Notes slipped under doors. Whispers that they wouldn't let this happen. Then came the fire. The grocery store had only been open a week when they burned it down. Clara stood in the smoke, watching the building collapse, her heart hammering. William grabbed her shoulder. "We should go." But she didn't move, because she finally understood. They hadn't burned down a store. They had tried to burn down an idea, and they had failed. By the time the next store opened, it wasn't just owned by Clara. It was owned by everyone. A co-op, funded by the people Havencrest had spent decades trying to erase. And when the white men of the town tried to shut it down, they lost. Because Clara Thompson had come home, and she wasn't leaving. Not this time. The summer heat pressed down on Havencrest like a curse that wouldn't lift. The grocery store stood at the edge of town, its freshly painted sign gleaming in the sunlight. It had been open for nearly 6 months now, owned and run by the very people this town had tried to erase. Clara Thompson had thought the hardest part was over. She had been wrong. Havencrest wasn't the kind of place that forgave, and it never forgot. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning. William Harper was stocking shelves when he heard the glass shatter. He turned just in time to see the brick land on the floor, knocking over a row of canned beans. There was a note attached. "Get out." He didn't touch it. Didn't need to. He already knew what it said. Instead, he grabbed the broom and started sweeping. By the time Clara arrived, the mess was gone. But the weight of it was still there. She looked at him. "Who saw?" William wiped sweat from his forehead. "Everyone," she exhaled, because that was the point. They wanted people to see. To remember that Havencrest belonged to them, that no matter how much had changed, some things never would. Clara crossed her arms. "Did anyone say anything?" William let out a humorless chuckle. "They never do." She clenched her jaw. She had expected this. She just hadn't expected what came next. The next day, a white man walked into the store. That wasn't unusual. Some had been coming since the store opened, more out of curiosity than anything else. Some had needed to see it for themselves. But this man was different. He was dressed too neatly, a crisp white shirt, a navy blue tie, polished shoes that didn't belong on Havencrest's dusty roads. Clara knew the type. A man with authority, a man with power, a man who had come to remind her exactly who she was dealing with. He walked up to the counter, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Thompson, I presume?" Clara didn't answer, just stared. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I'm John Mercer. I work with the State Commerce Board." Still, she said nothing. Mercer tapped the folder. "We received a complaint about your business. A legal concern." Clara's stomach turned. Here it was. She reached for the folder and flipped it open. Pages and pages of legal jargon. A fine for a zoning violation she'd never heard of. "This is nonsense," she said. Mercer just smiled. "I'm afraid it's very real. And if it's not resolved, this establishment will be shut down within 30 days. Silence. Then, William spoke. "Who filed the complaint?" Mercer's smile widened. "That information is confidential." "Of course it was." Clara exhaled slowly. "I'll fight this." Mercer's expression didn't change. "I imagine you will." He closed his briefcase and tipped his hat. "Good luck, Miss Thompson." Then he walked out. Clara didn't move, didn't breathe, because she knew exactly what had just happened. They had stopped throwing bricks. Now, they were coming with paperwork, and that was worse. She spent the next week in her mother's living room, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, trying to understand how they were taking something from her that she had built. Every loophole, every fine print, every excuse the state had to shut her down. and every handful of money that had been passed behind closed doors to make sure it happened. William sat across from her, flipping through the same papers. "They're not gonna stop," he muttered. She knew that, but neither was she. She went to Austin. She walked into the state capitol, wearing the best dress she owned. Standing before men who barely looked at her, she argued. She fought. She told them this was a lie. That Havencrest was trying to erase its own history. She stood in that office for 5 hours, but she didn't win. The letter arrived a week later. Final notice. Her store would be shut down by the end of the month. Clara stared at the letter. Then she burned it. She walked into the store the next morning. William was already there. She looked at him. "We're not closing." He frowned. "Clara!" She slammed her hands on the counter. "We're not closing." A long silence. Then William smiled. And just like that, Havencrest had a problem. When the sheriff arrived with the eviction notice, Clara was standing behind the counter. The store was full, not just with customers, with people. With everyone who had been pushed to the side, everyone who had been told to wait, everyone who had seen enough of Havencrest's hate to know they weren't going to let this happen. They stood behind Clara, and they didn't move. Sheriff Walker looked at the paper in his hands, then at the people staring him down, then at Clara. She crossed her arms. "You gonna arrest all of us?" Walker's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer because he knew he couldn't. Not with reporters standing outside, cameras ready. Not with the state already questioning why Havencrest had so many violations against one woman. Not with the world finally watching. So he folded the paper, and he walked out. A year later, the store was still standing. Bigger. Stronger. A symbol of something Havencrest couldn't kill. Clara stood outside watching the sun set. William leaned against the doorway. "You did it." She smiled. "Number we did." The battle wasn't over. It might never be. But Havencrest had changed, and it wasn't going back. The wind rolled heavy through Montgomery, Alabama, carrying the ghosts of history with it. The kind of history that didn't just live in books, but in blood. The kind of history that made people whisper the truth in hushed voices, afraid of what might happen if they spoke too loudly. For Desmond Carter, history wasn't something in the past. It was the fight he woke up to every day. He had grown up in a house that smelled like sawdust and sweat. His father had been a carpenter, his grandfather before him. They built Montgomery with their hands houses, schools, churches, but those same hands were never allowed to vote for the men who ran the city. Because Montgomery had a way of taking everything black people built and making them beg to keep it. Desmond wasn't a carpenter. He was a lawyer, first in his family to graduate college, first to fight the system from the inside. And now, he was about to fight the biggest case of his life. It started with the black farmers, men who had worked their land for generations, growing cotton, corn, and dignity. Men who had held onto their farms even when the government tried to push them out. Then, one by one, they started losing everything. Land stolen through fraudulent deeds, crops burned in the middle of the night, bank loans mysteriously denied. And the man behind it all? Judge William Beckett, a man whose family had been running Montgomery's legal system since the Civil War. A man who had been quietly stealing black-owned land for years, turning farms into developments, selling stolen soil to rich investors. No one had been able to stop him. Until Desmond. He sat in the back of a small Baptist church, the air thick with voices, pain, and the heat of a summer that never truly ended. The farmers gathered around, their faces etched with loss. They didn't trust lawyers, didn't trust the courts, because the courts had been used to destroy them. But Desmond didn't ask for trust. He showed them the proof, documents, forgery, the paper trail of a century-old theft disguised as legal paperwork. And then he made a promise. We'd take him to court. A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Beckett was untouchable, a god in Montgomery's legal system. But Desmond's voice was steady. We expose him. And that was the moment the war began. The case made headlines. The city called it baseless. The mayor called it an attack on Southern tradition. And then the threats came. Letters, calls in the middle of the night, walk away, Carter. But Desmond had never walked away from a fight in his life. The trial began on a Monday. The courtroom was packed. On one side, the farmers, their families, their ancestors sitting in silence, watching. On the other, Montgomery's power, white lawyers, bankers, developers. Judge Beckett sat at the bench, smiling like the outcome had already been decided. But Desmond had one thing Beckett didn't expect: evidence. Real, undeniable proof that Beckett had stolen thousands of acres, laundering the deeds through fake businesses. And the moment Desmond presented it, the room shifted. Because suddenly, Montgomery's king wasn't untouchable anymore. Beckett fought back. He called the evidence a lie, called Desmond a fraud. But Desmond had more. A witness. A man who had worked in the county records office for 40 years. A man who had seen the documents being changed. A man who had been waiting his whole life to tell the truth. And when he took the stand, Beckett's face went pale. Because the truth wasn't just being whispered anymore. It was being shouted. The verdict came 2 days later. Guilty. Beckett was stripped of his judgeship, his land seized, and the farms? They were returned to the families they had been stolen from. For the first time in history, Montgomery had been forced to admit its sins, and Desmond had won. But the fight wasn't over, because that night, someone set fire to his parents' house. A warning. A reminder that power never gives up without a fight.
Desmond stood in the ashes the next morning, his fists clenched. And that was when he knew he wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was going to run for district attorney. Because if they wanted a war, he was going to give them one. The rain hit Montgomery, Alabama like a slow-moving funeral procession, soft and steady, washing over a city that still bled beneath its surface. It had been 3 years since Desmond Carter had stood in a packed courtroom and done the unthinkably had taken down Judge William Beckett. 3 years since black farmers had gotten their stolen land back. 3 years since Montgomery had been forced to look in the mirror. And now, Desmond wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was the district attorney, the first black DA in Montgomery history. And the city wasn't ready for him. They had tried to stop him from winning, tried to smear his name in the papers, called him a radical, a troublemaker, a man who was out to destroy Southern values. But the people knew the truth. They had seen what Desmond had done in that courtroom, and they had elected him anyway. Now, he held the power they never wanted him to have, and he was going to use it. The case landed on his desk 1 month into office. A folder, thin, not many details, just a name. Jeremiah Lawson, a black boy, 17 years old, shot by police. They said he had a gun, said he had looked dangerous, said they had feared for their lives. And just like that, Jeremiah Lawson was dead. Another name on a list that was longer than history itself. Another boy buried before he ever had the chance to live. Desmond read the report twice. Something didn't add up. The evidence was thin. The witness statements contradicted each other. The gun they claimed he had, it had no fingerprints on it. And the officers involved? One of them had a history of complaints, of beatings, of using his badge to terrorize black communities. His name was Officer Patrick Reed, and now Desmond was coming for him. The city tried to stop him. The mayor called him. The police chief warned him, told him to let it go. But Desmond had spent his whole life watching black boys like Jeremiah get erased. He wasn't about to let it happen again. So he did what no district attorney in Montgomery had ever done before. He filed charges against Officer Reed for murder. The city exploded. White Montgomery called it an outrage, a political stunt. Protests erupted on both sides, and through it all, Desmond sat in his office, staring at his own reflection, because he knew this wasn't just a case, this was a war, and if he lost, they would never let him come for them again. The trial began on a Monday. The courtroom was a battlefield. Officer Reed sat at the defense table, smug, like he already knew he was going to walk free. His lawyer? One of the best in the state, a man who had built his career defending white men like Reed. And Desmond? He had the truth. The prosecution laid it out piece by piece. The body camera footage is suspiciously missing. The police reports altered. The gun planted. The witnesses threatened into silence. And when Desmond called his star witness to the stand, the whole courtroom held its breath. Because the person who walked in wasn't just anyone. It was another cop, Officer Daniel Brooks, a man who had been on the force for 20 years. And the moment he started speaking, everything changed. "They told us to cover it up," Brooks said, voice steady. "They told us Jeremiah had to be the bad guy." He swallowed hard. But he wasn't. He was unarmed. He was running away. He begged them not to shoot. And then his voice broke. They shot him anyway. The courtroom erupted. People shouted, cried. Officer Reed's lawyer tried to have Brooks removed, tried to have his testimony thrown out. But the jury had already seen the truth. And in that moment, they knew what they had to do. The verdict came in fast. Guilty.